And a very warm welcome to the LBC Book Club. Let me immediately introduce my two authors to you. They're actually both from the same publisher. I don't think we've had two authors from the same publisher before on the programme. Bloomsbury is our publisher. Anatole Kaletsky is the author of Capitalism 4.0, The Birth of a New Economy. It's got two fantastic endorsements on the front, actually. I'll give you that. It's George Soros. You don't get a much better endorsement than that. He says, this brilliant book will add greatly to our understanding of the future of global finance, and it's been longlisted for the Samuel Johnson Prize 2011. Our second author is Kwasi Kwarteng. He's the Conservative MP for Spelthorne. He's not writing a political book. It's a history book, Ghosts of Empire, Britain's Legacies in the Modern World. Again, I think this is something that Bloomsbury must have really decided to do, put endorsements on the front cover. It's not really normal on a hardback. Andrew Roberts says, the best general overview of the British Empire to appear in years. And Michael Burley says, I learned something new on virtually every page of this fine book. Well, you don't get much better endorsements than that. Welcome to you both to the programme. Now, if you have a question that you'd like to ask Anatole or Kwasi during the course of the programme, you know the number to call. It's 0845 6060 973. You can text a question to 84850, email Ian, IAIN, @lbc.co.uk, or you can even tweet us if you fancy doing that, @LBC973. I don't think either of you tweet, do you?
No, not much.
Actually, I've just started. Well, I've been put on Twitter, but I don't think I've yet sent out a message.
Now, Anatole, let's start with you. Whenever I see books about economics as a non-economist, and books about sort of capitalism with slightly intimidating titles, I approach them with a little bit of trepidation. But you've actually made this quite accessible to a normal person, shall I say, rather than an economics specialist. Did you feel that was very important from the outset?
Well, yeah, absolutely. Well, and I'm delighted to hear that you found it that way. I think the explanation is that it's not really a book about economics. It's not primarily about economics. It's really much more a book about politics, or to be a little more pompous about it, it's about political economy. It's about the interaction between economics and politics, and the fact that these two fields have got to be viewed together in a way that has been overlooked for the last 20 years. 20 or 30 years, there's been this assumption that economics is a kind of is a science which deals with laws of nature which are somehow immutable and God-given, and we've all got to obey them. And politics is something that happens over here on the side, but really can't interfere with the iron laws of economics. And my main argument in the book is that actually it was that conception of an overly rigid sort of economic model that actually led to the crisis of 2008 and all the subsequent
What do you mean by a rigid economic model?
Precisely the idea that economics is a law unto itself, that the market is always right, and that market forces can always be trusted to solve not only the problems of society, but also to resolve the difficulties that they themselves create. So, the obvious one being in the field of finance, where market forces generated an enormous financial bubble, and until far too late in the day, in 2008, policymakers, both on the left and obviously on the right, but also on the left, assumed that somehow markets would be able to solve these problems themselves. They didn't. Instead, the system was like a pressure cooker which just got hotter and hotter and hotter and eventually blew up. If somebody in politics had been aware of the need for a political intervention in market forces, they would have, in my view, been able to release the valve on that pressure cooker much earlier. So we would not have had the collapse that we've had in the last few years.
In effect, you're saying that it happened, at least in part, maybe in major part, to the fact that the politicians failed to regulate properly.
That's one aspect of it, but what I try to discuss in this book is that the lack of regulation of finance was only, if you like, the tip of the iceberg of a much more general failure of politics to understand that the market and the business system cannot operate on its own without a degree of government intervention. Now, obviously, everybody now agrees about that with regard to banking and finance, but it's also true in a lot of other fields, in energy and employment, in housing, many, and above all, in the management of the economy as a whole, so-called macroeconomics, where you have to use interest rates, currency policy, fiscal policy in a fairly active way if you want your economy to be stable. At least that's my belief. Now, and the objection of that is, well, that means just going back to the 1960s of, government is always right. And this is a more subtle point that I'd very much like to answer.
Well, Kwasi, you're a politician, and when you hear words like that, do you think, well, actually, most politicians aren't equipped to regulate these very, very complicated fields at all?
I think that is true, but also, what concerns me about Anatole's thesis is that he is essentially echoing, I think, a left-wing interpretation of the crisis. I know he's not left-wing and he's a great capitalist, but essentially the narrative on the left is that...
I was going to say, it's a good job there's 5 feet between you after saying that, right?
The essential narrative is that reckless bankers, irresponsible private sector people created a bubble, and that once the bubble collapsed, it's now the job for governments.
But the point is, they were allowed to create the bubble.
They were allowed to create the bubble. I accept that. But also, I think something certainly in Britain and America. If we look at Britain and America, the deficit has been the big issue, and if you look at the way governments behaved in the last 10 years, from 2000 certainly, was that they ran huge deficits. They were spending far too much money. And I would argue that the reason why the crash, when it happened, was so severe was that the market essentially had broken down because the US were borrowing huge amounts of money at unprecedentedly low interest rates. And that created a climate in which bankers in the Midwest, I know these people, they were saying, look, we needed to get yield, we need to get a return on our loans, and that's why they went into the subprime market.
How much is this due to human nature, though, as well as the failure for politicians to regulate? I'm reading a book at the moment, which my company's publishing in a few weeks, by Matthew Hancock and Nadeem Zahawi, two your fellow MPs, and they're basically blaming a lot of it on the failings of human nature.
No, absolutely. It is absolutely due to human nature, and that's why I think Kwasi's criticism or critique of what I'm saying isn't quite right. What I'm saying is that there is an intrinsic human element in which always causes financial crisis and always causes economic instability. And we should never have assumed that the market, whether it's the financial market or the economy more broadly, can regulate itself. At the same time, I don't think we can assume, this is answering your question about politicians, I don't think we can assume that governments can get it right either. And in fact, the reason I've called this book Capitalism 4.0 is that what I'm arguing is that really capitalism has gone through this 3 phases already, and this is the 4th phase. Now, the phase before that was Thatcherism, if you like, and we all believed, or everybody was told to believe, that the market is always right and the government is always wrong. In the previous phase...
Slight generalisation, but I'll forgive you it.
No, the previous phase, which was, if you like, the Keynesian phase, we assumed that the market is always wrong and the government is always right. And the first phase, I argue, in the 19th century, was people just didn't see any connection between the market and government. And what I'm saying, the fundamental, the one-sentence message of this book is that the main lesson of the crisis is that the government and the market can both be wrong. Now, that sounds very depressing, but I argue that that's actually quite empowering.
But do you get to the point where they can both be right?
Yeah, well, they're never going to be perfectly right, but we are always at a point when they are capable of improvement. That's why we need both market forces and a conscious political input into the economy constantly to be trying to adjust, to improve, to move sort of 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And I think that's basically where the world is going after the crisis.
Kwasi, do you buy into this 4 phases of capitalism?
I think I've read the book on holiday when it was a hardback book and it had a blue cover. Now it's got a red cover, so it's very interesting. And
You're one of the few people who take hardbacks on holidays. I salute you, sir.
I do. They look very impressive. They look very impressive. But I think the way that Anatole split up that period of time, I thought was really clever and really interesting. My only caveat is that I'm very reluctant to use this crisis as an excuse for governments to step in. I know that's not what he's saying, but you're hearing a lot of people saying that governments now should have more power. And
well, I am saying they need to step in more in some areas. I think the other thing we've got to
recognize... Are you in the better regulation rather than more regulation?
Well, exactly. Another slogan that I keep using in this book is that we're moving into a period where governments are getting smaller and bigger at the same time. So they're going to get bigger in terms of they have to regulate more parts of the economy, but crucially, they've got to get smaller in the sense that they've got to absorb less resources, they've got to cut the amount of spending, most of which is devoted to pensions and health and so on. So it's smaller and bigger at the same time.
Well, that's the voice of Anatole Kaletsky. His book is Capitalism 4.0, The Birth of a New Economy. And you're going to hear a lot more from Kwasi Kwarteng in the next section of the programme. He's written a book called Ghosts of Empire, Britain's Legacies in the Modern World. They're both published by Bloomsbury Publishing. You're listening to the LBC Book Club. The time now is 9:15. And here's Alan Joyce with the LBC Travel.
Thanks, Ian. The M3 still has 1 lane closed coming into town between Junction...
Now.
It's Ian Dale here with you until 10 o'clock tonight. Anthony Davis will be here from 10 until 1 a.m. But until 10, you're going to be listening to the LBC Book Club. Kwasi Kwarteng is with me. He's the author of Ghosts of Empire, Britain's Legacies in the Modern World. And Anatole Kaletsky is here too. Capitalism 4.0, The Birth of a New Economy is his book. Now let's turn to you, Kwasi. You and I belong to a generation, I know you're younger than me, so before you say anything, belong to a generation for which the empire is something sort of slightly distant. And I think my first connection with the empire was really when I went on a school exchange trip to Germany and went to some English lessons in a German school. Yeah. And they decided in these lessons that the English are still obsessed with the empire and are still struggling to get over the loss of empire. Do you think there's any justification in that?
I don't think that's true. I think one of the reasons why I wrote the book was precisely because, as you say, for people our age, I'm not going to say how old you are or how old
I'm
I am.
49, I'm not embarrassed.
For people our age, the empire is something that was impossibly remote. And, I come from a Ghanaian family. My parents grew up in the empire. And so I've got that connection to it.
In the Gold Coast, as it was
then called. The Gold Coast, as it then was. And so I've got that connection with it. But a lot of people in Britain, regardless of their background, know very little about it. And I felt that it would be quite interesting, to do some research into the empire, because it had such an impact on not only modern Britain, in terms of the way, numbers of people came in from the colonies to live here, but also in the wider world as well. So it was a very interesting topic for me to look into.
You deal with the creation of the empire and the legacy, but you've actually chosen to write about specific countries. It's not a sort of... it's not about the whole empire, it is about specific countries within the empire. I suppose that allows you to do a volume 2.
Well, there was a reason why I chose those countries.
Well, let's say what they are. Iraq, Kashmir, Burma, Sudan, Nigeria and Hong Kong.
That's right. And they all, I think, sort of typified or brought out a certain feature about imperial rule that I wanted to talk about. Now, some reviewers have said, well, you could have chosen, I think one chap said, I could have chosen Botswana. But Botswana is quite a small country, and it doesn't appear very much in the news. And it's a really an appendage. Or I don't want to offend any Botswanans out there.
You just did,
it doesn't feature very much in the news. I wanted to understand some of the main currents of global politics, places like Iraq, places like Hong Kong, places like Sudan, where there's the newest country, the South Sudan, just emerged this year. And I felt the empire was a good way of looking into that. And I drew some conclusions from my research on those countries. They're case studies, if you like, from which I try and tease out bigger themes.
I mean, we're often told by a wide range of thinkers and historians that the British Empire was a sort of an exponent of democracy and free trade around the world. But you take a slightly different view. You argue it was about a natural hierarchy. What do you mean by that?
I think it's very easy for the neocons, especially when George Bush was president and they were trying to export democracy around the world, to say that the British Empire was somehow a prelude to American rule. But what I was trying to do in the book was to try and understand the British Empire in its own terms. It was very hierarchical. It was very deferential. It was much like Britain was, 50 or 60 years ago. But I make the point that the empire was even worse in that way. I mean, it was even more hierarchical. Britain was changing at a much faster rate, even in the 20s and 30s, than the empire. And a lot of people went out to the empire because they wanted to get away from what they thought was socialism. I quote one of the people saying that Lloyd George was, the spawn of Satan, essentially. And they felt that that was a way in which they could go off and be individualists and do their own thing without having to worry about democracy at home. So in a way, what I'm saying that the empire, far from being pro-democratic, the empire was very anti-democratic in the sense that it relied on hierarchies, it relied on what they called natural rulers. Lord Cromer talked about the best of our breed, the athletic and mental culture of Britain, the best of it which was represented in the empire. That's the kind of language which they talked about, the administrators. And any idea of implanting democracy in these countries was very far from their minds.
Can you actually date the start of the British Empire?
Well, there were two empires. I mean, this is the classic. The first empire ended in 1776, essentially, when America decided to go its own way. So if you were in 18th century London, if you talked about the British Empire, they would think immediately of New England. That was their empire. The second empire.
Those were the days.
Those are the real days. That was but then of course when America went its own way, that in a way could be the date of the second empire, and very much the crown and the jewel of that. The second empire was the Raj. And that ended in 1947 with Indian and Pakistani independence.
And how did we get into... I mean, India's not sort of... Well, Kashmir is part of this,
very much.
How did we get into India in the first place?
Well, there are lots of different theories. I mean, the classic 19th century theory is that the empire was made in a fit of absence of mind. So we somehow stumbled into all these countries, largely driven to make money by trade. And with the Indian Empire, I think there's a good case to be made for that, because it was, of course, the East India Company, which had been set up centuries before. It was set up in 1600 by Queen Elizabeth. And they were essentially a bunch of merchants who managed to get into India as a trading company and essentially ruled India till 1857.
So it was Anatole. It was the first stage of capitalism, then.
Well, I was going to say if it was capitalism that drove it, clearly, but the other comparison is with imperialism, as it's understood today, of course, is American imperialism driven by capitalism. And what do you think is there a relationship between the imperialism of Britain in the 19th century and the imperialism, as is perceived, of America today?
Well, I touch upon this in my book. I talk about the relations that we had with Iraq after the First World War, and the Americans were trying to muscle in and get the oil. And the Americans were, in a way, much more capitalistic about their imperialism. They had no interest, certainly until very recently, in actually governing these countries. If you look at Iraq in the 20s, however, British officials were talking to the king. We set up the monarchy there. We were advising people politically, as well as doing the oil deals. The Americans were only focused, certainly in Iraq in the 20s, on the oil.
But it's ironic, isn't it? Because, as you said, the neocons and George W. Bush over the last 10 years were talking as if American imperialism is all about creating political systems, about creating democracy around the world. But actually, as you say, they've been they haven't been concerned at all with the governance of these countries with which they had an imperial connection.
Well, I think the reason that was the case was that they completely underestimated the level of commitment you need to try and bring in about democracy. The point about the British Empire, the point about what I make in my Iraq chapters, is that we spent a huge amount of money and resource, people on the ground, people who could speak Arabic. There's one couple of people I described, they could speak 3 or 4 different dialects of Arabic. They spent 20, 30 years in the Middle East. And even they couldn't bring a solution to some of these problems. So the idea that the American army was going to come in, wipe out a few Iraqi bad guys, and then leave Iraq safe for democracy was I think slightly misguided and unrealistic.
The interesting thing is that, I mean, what you're saying is a lot of these countries weren't conquered. We didn't invade them.
No.
It was all done because of commercial interests.
Well, a lot of it was done because of commercial interests, but the idea that the empire was purely run on a commercial basis, I think, is wrong, because you look at certain countries, certainly Nigeria before they discovered oil, it was very difficult to see how the British government was making any money out of it. And there were other places, for example, Burma, a lot of merchants, so there was a company called Steel Brothers who were from Glasgow. They made money out of rice. But the government itself, the British government, didn't make much money. So the interests of you've got to distinguish the interests of the merchants and British people who happen to be making money from the government. And it's unclear to me that the actual government was making much money. I don't think we made any money out of Hong Kong. Clearly, British people made a lot of money there, and they were sort of paying taxes, some of them. But the government, as an enterprise, didn't make money out of Hong Kong.
Well, we'll talk more about the empire and capitalism in just a few moments' time. 0845 6060 973 if you have a question for either of my authors, Kwasi Kwarteng and Anatole Kaletsky.
This is LBC 97.
Now, coming up at 10 o'clock, Anthony Davis will be asking for your thoughts on Libya. Has Britain's involvement been vilified, I think they mean justified, following events in Libya over recent days? Somebody's gone mad here. Do we need to consider our place in the world order? Also, is Joan Collins right? A question that we often ask on this programme. What is wrong with our youngsters? Are issues all down to bad parenting? And children are more likely to read text messages and emails than novels, a survey suggests. Is this a worry? All that and more with Anthony Davis from 10. Let me reintroduce my two guests here on the book club. Anatole Kaletsky is the author of Capitalism 4.0, The Birth of a New Economy, published by Bloomsbury in paperback at the amazingly cheap price of £10.99. And Kwasi Kwarteng is the author of Ghosts of Empire, Britain's Legacies in the Modern World. Slightly more expensive, but it's a very big hardback at £25 and well worth the money, I would say. Now, Anatole, you just wanted to ask Kwasi about something that he mentioned just before we went to the news.
Well, I think one of the really interesting points Kwasi makes in his book is about the effect of British imperialism on politics within Britain. And as he was saying earlier, that it provided a sort of escape valve. The empire provided a sort of escape valve for the conservative, if you like, reactionary elements in America, in British politics, which didn't like what was going on in the 20th century with Lloyd George and so on. And the comparison that struck me is with America today, because you said, Kwasi, you have a quote about Lloyd George being the spawn of the devil in your book. Right now in America, 14% of the population of the voters in America have told Harris pollsters that President Obama, quotes, may be the Antichrist. Literally 14%. Now, America doesn't have that kind of escape valve for the extreme conservatism. And I think that's one of the reasons why America is actually finding it much more difficult to adapt to the revisionism of capitalism that's required, which is what I'm writing about in my book. You know, America, to my surprise in the last couple of years, has moved further to the right instead of moving to the center, which is what most of us expected when Obama was elected. And I wonder whether the lack of an empire, in a way, is connected with that.
I think that's an interesting point. I mean, what I would say is that the numbers involved of people who decided to leave Britain so that they could become a district commissioner in the Sudan was always very small. But clearly, what I was saying was that Britain in the 20s and 30s was changing. Lloyd George didn't have a university education, was from a very humble background. Ramsay MacDonald was illegitimate. Now these people, and they managed to be prime minister. These people would never have got anywhere in the colonial empire. And that was a point that is often forgotten.
Because of their schooling.
Because of their schooling, because of their background. The colonial empire drew from a much narrower pool of people than were actually succeeding in politics in Britain, and was, I think, a sort of haven for more reactionary types of people. Now, if there are 14% of Americans, that's a huge number, and no matter how big their empire was, that's not going to really be an effective valve in that way. But it is true, I think empires, generally the people who run them, tend to be slightly more reactionary, perhaps, than the actual politicians in the mother country.
Right, let's go to Jason in Bayswater. Hello, Jason.
Yeah, good evening. Good evening. Yes, I'd just like to put this question to you, maybe to enlighten us all who are listening. I mean, I've been to Singapore and Hong Kong a few times, and when I'm walking the streets there and you can look around, you can see and with the history over the last 50 odd years with Singapore and over 100 years with Hong Kong, that in such a short period of time, with no welfare state or minimal welfare state, they've been such a beacon of entrepreneurship and got some of the highest standard of living in the world as well as GDP. What can the UK, when you think about it, it was a UK idea, Singapore and Hong Kong, what can we learn to transform our country in these debts and struggles that we're going through at the moment and get back to philosophies that we had before the times of like Lloyd George and after the 45 with the introduction of the welfare state?
Well, Jason, it's a very interesting question. Of course, Rupert Murdoch, in his evidence to the Select Committee, quoted Singapore as an absolute model economy. Anatole?
Well, yes, I think this is a great question for both of us, actually. And what I would say is that actually Hong Kong and Singapore, from a political economy standpoint, are very, very different models. They're not the same at all. Hong Kong is fairly close to a real free market economy, although even there the government has played a very big role in the property market. Essentially all the property in Hong Kong belonged to the government and they've been gradually letting it off. Most people in Hong Kong, even today, are what we would call council tenants in Britain. They live in properties belonging to the government. But in Singapore, we have a very, very active government, but crucially, absolutely, as Jason says, almost no welfare state. And in a way, this is what I'm talking about as the next phase of capitalism. My Capitalism 4.0 is one in which you have governments like Singapore that actually get quite deeply involved in the regulation of markets, but back away from the really costly responsibilities of government, which were built up, as Jason says, over the course of the 20th century for providing pensions, healthcare, things that increasingly people can and I think will be forced to provide for themselves.
I think Jason makes an excellent point. And with Hong Kong, which I did a lot of research on, it was particularly interesting to see that the 60s and 70s were the decades when Hong Kong went to a free market model. Because there was this man that Anatole will remember, a guy called John Cooperthwaite, who essentially was an ultra-free market man. And Milton Friedman, the great economist, went there and was incredibly impressed. Now, you don't have to be a historian to remember the 60s and 70s were precisely the decades in Britain where we had moved very much away from a kind of free market entrepreneurial model. And we were in a very, very statist, high-tax economy. And so Hong Kong and Britain very much diverged after the Second World War. And I think Jason's premise is right. I think we could learn, and we have learned from Hong Kong's success. Certainly Margaret Thatcher learned from it. And she managed to cut those very high rates of tax to try and create an entrepreneurial economy. The highest rates of tax were 83%. People were paying marginal rates of 98 before 1979. So, in a way, I think we have somehow learned some of those lessons, but obviously there's a way to go.
So you would advocate removing the 50p tax rate, would you?
Well, I'm on very contentious ground, but I think...
Simple yes or no?
I think the 50% tax rate has to be looked at and learned.
Anatole, going back to your book, how do you think politics and politicians have got to change themselves in this world of Capitalism 4.0 that you outline?
Well, I think the crucial thing is it's very much what we were talking about just now, that the primary responsibilities of government and politicians in the economy in the last 50 years have become paying for the two key spending programs of the welfare state: pensions, what we call national insurance, and the National Health Service. Between them, they take up roughly half of all government spending. And they have been growing much faster than everything else. And essentially, they've been an incubus on the government, eating up all the tax revenues, all the incremental tax revenues available from a growing economy. I think what we've got to recognize is that those parts of government are going to have to be more and more restricted, partly because they're too expensive, but also because those are things that in a more advanced economy people can cater for themselves to a large extent. While those parts of governments are restricted, though, politicians have to recognize greater responsibilities than they've seen over the last 20 years for managing the economy, ensuring full employment, regulating the financial system, ensuring sufficient investment in science, infrastructure, energy technologies. These are things that the market has shown it cannot do for itself. So we've got to recognize there are some things where there will be more market and less government, but other areas where the trend is going to be in the other direction.
It's a very brave and courageous politician, as Sir Humphrey might say, who will say to the electorate, "You're on your own, mates."
I don't think we're there yet in any way. But it's interesting that given the political debate about cutting welfare spending, I think we have shifted on that. I think Anatole's right. I think many Conservatives were worried that when we were capping things like housing benefit, that there would be a huge outcry. But talking to people in the streets and looking at polls, people seem to think that it might be a good idea for us to try and rein back some of the welfare spending that we've indulged in the past.
But I would say that even within that welfare field, the present government has actually got its priorities wrong. What they've done is they've cut disability payments, some unemployment payments. But what the one part of the government budget has been totally preserved, even inflation-adjusted terms, has been the national insurance pension. The other part has been the National Health Service, which is the only part of government spending that is still going up in real terms at the same rate as the economy. Now, those, in my view, are precisely the parts of government operations that are going to have to be reduced over time in order to make more space both for the private sector to grow, but also for the government to do the things that only government can do.
Now, we're obsessed at the moment, understandably so, by debts and deficits. They're affecting the future of the Eurozone. The Americans nearly came towards defaulting on their debt only a few weeks ago. I know we talked about the Eurozone on the programme a couple of weeks ago, Anatole. Yes. How does all that fit into your world of capitalism 4.0? Has that got to be the main thing which politicians need to address?
Absolutely not. And here, I very much disagree with Kwasi and with David Cameron and George Osborne. And I think this is again part of the misconception of the kind of misconception I'm trying to talk about in my book. The government's debts are the assets of the private sector. This is all about how I keep talking about how you have to see the private sector and the public sector together. When the government borrows money, who is it borrowing that money from? It's borrowing it from you and me. So if the government owes $1 billion,
printing it.
But printing money is not debt. Printing money is cash. But again, even that cash is our asset. What I'm trying to say is that for the private sector to pay back its debts, which is basically what's happening now after the banking crisis, the government is forced into a position where it has to spend more money than it takes in for a substantial period. If it didn't do that, we would have a much deeper recession that we would indeed have a 1930-style depression, which so far has been avoided, and I'm convinced will be avoided. So you've got to see the government's debts in the context of the whole economy, and actually the build-up of government debt so far has actually been beneficial for the private sector of the economy. Doesn't mean that it should go on. Doesn't mean it should go on. Because, as I say, the government's debts, if the government owes £1 billion, who does it owe it to?
What about
it owes it to you and me, so we are £1 billion richer than we were before.
But
you see, we're poorer as taxpayers, but we're richer as savers.
This argument is getting very sophisticated. I mean, essentially,
we do have to go to the travel in 30 seconds' time, so be quick.
You're saying that the debt. Why shouldn't we have bigger debts then? If they're all our assets, why don't we just run huge debts?
We can have bigger debts, and I think we were right to build up the debts over the last 3 years. We're now getting to a point where the private economy is beginning to recover, and so it can begin to stand on its own feet.
Well, we've entered the world of controversy here, which we may continue in just a couple of minutes' time. You're listening to the LBC Book Club with me, Ian Dale, with Anatole Kaletsky and Kwasi Kwarteng. This is LBC 97.3. It's 9:46. And here's Alan Joyce with the LBC Travel.
Thanks, Ian. The M3 has now fully reopened northbound with
Well, it's a very intellectual LBC book club. I'm struggling to keep up with some of the economics here, but we're with Anatole Kaletsky, the author of Capitalism 4.0, The Birth of a New Economy, published by Bloomsbury at £10.99 in paperback, and Kwasi Kwarteng, who's written Ghosts of Empire, Britain's Legacies in the Modern World, also published by Bloomsbury, hardback at £25. Now, we're going to conclude the sort of little rowette that we had just before the travel there. Anatole, let me give you the final word.
Okay, so the question is, why shouldn't the government just borrow more and more and more? The long answer is, read my book. That's 400
but he
pages.
has, and he still doesn't understand.
The short answer is inflation. If you get to the point where the government is spending money and the private sector is spending money, and that creates inflation, then somebody's got to stop spending. In my view, we haven't yet got to the point. There's some controversy, but I don't think there's much evidence of inflation. If we had inflation, the government would have to spend less.
Right. Let's go back to Kwasi's book. Now, Kwasi, in a poll taken in Jamaica this year, 1,000 people were asked whether they think they'd be better off if they'd remained a British colony. 60% said yes. Only 17% said no.
Wow.
What does that say about our legacy of empire?
I think, in terms of legacy, I
Because
think...
I've seen similar polls to this in other former empire countries.
In Jamaica, there has been, in some parts of Kingston, a total breakdown of law and order. And I think when people...
A bit like Tottenham, then.
Well, I thought we weren't going to go into that. But when people look back at the empire, certainly they look to law and order, to British justice. I talk about British justice in Hong Kong. That was a huge deal. They're not looking to democracy. That's not what they're interested in. They're interested in, can I cross and go over to my auntie's at night? And that's the sort of thing you could do under the British Empire. Now, to what extent the British Empire was responsible for that is an open question. I mean, societies have changed. Britain has changed itself. So if Jamaica was on the British Empire now, I'm sure there'd be more crime, because that's the nature of modern capitalism.
Because
in the modern world.
It does indicate a certain nostalgia for the empire.
Definitely.
Not just in Jamaica, but in many countries,
I think there is. I think there is. I mean, my argument was essentially coming out of the Iraq War, which was essentially a neocon war, saying that we should export democracy around the world and capitalism. And what I've said about the empire was that it wasn't about those things. That doesn't mean that people don't look back to it with fondness, because I think in terms of law and order, I think justice and a sense of fair play, and also educational opportunities. I think there was a sense in which British education was looked up to as the best in the world, and people certainly of my parents' generation who were educating the colonies received a very good education at the hands of British colonial administrators. That's got nothing to do with democracy and free market capitalism in the way that the neocons were trying to export that around the world.
I think one of the things we've learnt in the last few years is that if you give people a choice between dictatorship and anarchy, they will choose dictatorship every time, and rightly so.
That's right. That's right. And I think, in a way, what I say was it wasn't liberal democracy; it was benign authoritarianism. That's a long phrase, but that's what it kind of was.
Sort of Tony Blair type.
Well, a bit more. I think they did for more sort of corporal punishment and caning.
Do you think? Oh, I'm sure that was next on the list. Do you think that there's a lot of revisionism about the British Empire now? Whereas, I mean, a lot of historians, a lot of academics tend to be on the left, and they tend to think of the British Empire as a bad thing.
Yeah.
Now, I'm sure there were sort of negative aspects to it, but from what you say, we need to look at it slightly differently.
Definitely, I think there's a crude left-wing view which says that the British Empire was all about commercial exploitation and raping the resources of countries and enslaving the people. I think that's crude Marxist rubbish, frankly. The right-wing view is that it was all about democracy and cricket and free market capitalism. That's also wrong. It's a much more nuanced picture. I think things about to do with hierarchy and class are very important. I think things to do themes about authority, about discipline, all those sorts of things were also very important. So it's a much more mixed picture than just to say they were raping and pillaging and exploiting these countries, or that they were the British were sending out democracy and free trade and cricket.
And what do you
I think it's a much more nuanced picture.
What do you conclude about the legacy of empire? I mean, we have the Commonwealth now, which to most people, most people don't even really know what the Commonwealth is or what it does. It could have been a much more important institution.
But then we
couldn't
joined
it?
the EU.
Well, that's kind of what I was coming on to,
That's right.
because some of us would have liked there to have been a federation, but a grouping of maybe sort of ex-empire countries, including the likes of Australia, Canada, New Zealand, as well as the other Commonwealth countries, and have a free trade bloc that way, because we have more in common with these countries.
I think there was a view, I mean, that was killed dead, I think, in the 60s, when we essentially decided, and then we finally joined in 73, to cast our lot with Europe. The legacy of the empire is very mixed. I was very much driven by and interested in the personalities, and I'll just say this at the end, that the individualism and the self-reliance and the sheer sort of determination of some of these characters that I researched into was phenomenal. And looking at modern Britain, I think one of the legacies of empire that we've lost is this sense of self-reliance, is this sense that people can get up and actually do extraordinary things. And I think the modern welfare state that we've talked about has in many ways sapped this kind of individual initiative. And looking at the world of empire, 100 years ago, I was struck by how different the mentality was of some of these empire builders. I mean, you can love them or loathe them, but you cannot but admire the resilience and the strength of character that pushed them to do what they did. And I think some of that spirit, that entrepreneurial, self-starting spirit, is something that we could learn from.
Do you think that's right, Anatole? That there's this sort of loose-knit alliance of English-speaking countries, and most of the ex-empire countries you would put into that category, I suppose. I mean, there is a movement in America called the Anglosphere movement.
I was going to say,
which,
there was this concept,
which I was sort of vaguely involved in at one time, that promotes a much stronger alliance between these countries.
Well, I think there was this concept of the Anglosphere, and obviously they do have a lot in common. It makes sense, really, if you bring the United States into it. If it's just Britain and Canada and Australia, who cares? If you bring the United States into it, you do have a block of countries which share many common values as well as a language. The question, though, is whether Western Europe is also really part of that broad Western Anglosphere as we move towards a global society where it's really China, Latin America, Africa, Russia. Europe and America and the Anglosphere have far more in common with each other than they do with China or
That's
the
right,
rest of the
but
world.
I think in terms of the Anglosphere, I mean, as someone whose parents have come from a colony, I think that the English language and the English legal system are things that are absolutely defining of India, of what was the Gold Coast, Ghana, America, all these places. And in many ways, Western Europe, with its kind of Napoleonic legal tradition, is a very different animal from the Anglosphere. So I think Ian's right. I think there is but how that actually is fleshed together in terms of what kind of trade agreements, what kind of political institutions that we have, I think that's a different question. I think that's a much harder question.
We haven't got much time left, but pick out two or three of the biggest characters in your book, the people who really made the British Empire what it became.
The central figure of the empire is Kitchener, and everyone knows Kitchener because he's the man.
Your country needs you.
Exactly, your country needs you, and practically everybody knows that. And he was a very, very bizarre sort of character. I mean, he had a really strict father, very eccentric guy who didn't want to have bed linen, so he made them use newspapers to sleep. And they had to sleep, and he used to shout at people if they came a minute early or a minute late. They had to arrive exactly.
It's a bit like
on time.
my producer when the news comes.
Exactly, and this produced this sort of hot-housed, highly disciplined environment. Produced this man who was nicknamed the Sudan Machine. I mean, he was an absolutely remorseless and relentless sort of martinet. And they said that the officers that worked under him, they never really loved him, but they respected him because he was very, very capable. And he showed a lot of drive. And just to finish it off, someone said, "Oh, well, I've got to Khartoum. It took me 3 weeks to get from Cairo to Khartoum." And Kitchener just said to him, "It took me 3 years because you've been campaigning all the way and trying to build the railway." Whereas this chap had just sort of come in at the end.
Well, gentlemen, it's been an absolute pleasure. I'm sure I speak on behalf of everyone listening. Anatole Kaletsky, thank you very much. Your book, Capitalism 4.0, and Kwasi Kwarteng, Ghosts of Empire. Anthony Davis is coming up next. This is LBC 97.3.
Where can you find free content?